Hi, Roxy Keller here again, continuing to bake my way through the Great British Baking Show challenges, and it's Bread Week of 2017. This is the second challenge of the week, which is the technical challenge, and the bakers were asked to make Paul Hollywood's classic cottage loaf, and this is apparently something that is common in Britain. I had never heard of one or seen one, but the challenge for the bakers is definitely proving for the correct amount of time and baking for the correct amount of time and putting the two balls of dough together properly. Well, since I've seen the show, I know how it needs to be done. Let's see if I can do it. Also, the bakers did not have a stand mixer, and so they had to do all of the kneading by hand. I have a stand mixer. I'm not on the show, so I'm going to use my stand mixer to do the kneading. So I'll start by weighing out the ingredients. And so I have the mixing bowl from my stand mixer on my scale, and I'm going to weigh out 500 grams of bread flour. Okay, that's 500 grams of bread flour. As in the last challenge, the instructions say to add the yeast directly to the bowl, but I'm going to rise my yeast first in a little bit of warm water. Proving your yeast is definitely not absolutely necessary, especially when you have confidence in your yeast like I do with this Red Star Platinum yeast. I just like to do it maybe because I think it's cool to look at it when it's foaming. And if something goes wrong, I know that wasn't the problem. Okay, so I will let that sit for about 5 minutes and then we'll continue. Okay, so the yeast is nice and foamy with the water, and the instructions say to put the yeast on one side and put the salt on the other, but I am going to listen to my favorite podcaster that I told you about in my last video, the Home Baking Podcast, and she suggests that you add the salt after the autolyze step, so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to add the yeast and 100 milliliters of water to the flour. Then the recipe calls for 50 grams of lard, and I'm not opposed to using lard, but I don't have any, and there's several inches of snow on the ground, so I'm just going to use vegetable shortening. I put it in the microwave so it will be nice and soft. 50 grams of vegetable shortening. Then it says to add a total of 300 to 350 milliliters of water, depending on how dry your house is and how dry your flour is. So it suggests to put in just a portion of that, which I already have some of that with the yeast, and I'm going to add a little bit more, and then we'll see how much I need. I'm going to stir that. Still pretty shaggy. That's shaggy. So I need more water. Altogether, I think I added about 300 milliliters. So now I'm going to autolyze, which is not in this recipe, but I am a believer in the autolyze step, which is the step that allows the flour to absorb the water and starts developing the gluten. So I'm going to let that sit for half an hour, and then we'll start kneading. Okay, it's been about half an hour, so the autolyze step is done. Now it's time to knead the dough. I'm going to go ahead and add the salt. The recipe calls for 7 grams of fine salt, and I always buy kosher salt and then grind it in my salt grinder. So 7 grams of fine salt. That was a little less than half a tablespoon. As I mentioned in the competition, the bakers had to do the kneading by hand because this is supposed to be a classic cottage loaf, which means that they didn't have mixers like we have today. But I have one, so I'm going to use it. So I'm putting this on the mixer with the dough hook. And I'll knead this for about 8 minutes. Partway through, I do like to clean off the dough hook. And sort of flip it around to make sure that all the bits are getting stretched. It's looking good though. Okay, now it's time to let the dough rise. So I will put the dough into this bowl in a ball shape and then place it on my heat mat to prove. I'm turning it out onto the counter just so I can get it into a nice ball. I like to use this bowl because it's shallow and it's fairly easy to tell when the dough has doubled in size. So I'll spray this with a bit of baking spray, make it easy to come out. And there are a lot of ways to prove your dough. You want it to be in a warm area, warm like 75 to 85 degrees. And I don't have a proving drawer, I don't have a proving mat per se, but because I'm a botanist and I do a lot of growing plants from seeds, I do have this heat mat that I can set to 77 degrees. Then I'll place the bowl with the dough in it with some plastic wrap over it, and there's my proving drawer. There's a nice ball. Okay, so that will take about 45 minutes to an hour to double in size. Okay, so it's been about 50 minutes and I think the dough has doubled in size. I keep my mat at 77 degrees. So I'm curious how the bakers could have gotten this done in 2.5 hours, because if it needs to prove twice and then bake for 40 minutes, there's no way you can do that in 2.5 hours. Anyway, okay, so now I'm going to shape this into the cottage loaf shape. And I need to weigh it. $874. So at 874 grams, 1/3 of that would be 291, and that's how much you're supposed to cut off for the top of the cottage loaf. Before that, I need to knock out the air, and it says to do that by pulling from the outside in and doing that multiple times. As you do that, it gets tougher and tougher because you're redeveloping that gluten, getting all the air out. Now I need to cut off 1/3. It's just a guess, but I'll weigh it. This one actually says to tear it off rather than cut it, but okay, so there's 1/3, so that will be the top ball. So I do need to prove it a second time, but I do it after I get it into the cottage loaf shape. It has some pretty detailed and strange instructions about doing that, because now that we've knocked out all the air, there's no way to roll it. It says to roll it. Yeah, there's no way to do that. So I'll just have to do this folding bit. So they call this a cob. And the reason that you do that spinning and pinching is because you want the top to be nice and smooth. It's funny because this doesn't really feel like a third of that, maybe after I smush it. So we keep tucking that and spinning it, and we get a nice round shape on the top. Do the same thing with this. Okay, these are the two balls, sized as the instructions say. Doesn't look quite as big as the ones in the competition, but maybe it's because it hasn't risen yet. Okay, so you're supposed to flour your first two fingers, press down in the middle. And the idea is that if this is pressed down, then when it bakes, it will stay together. So if you don't do that, this top part could just slide off. So let me do it one more time. Make sure I did it nice and tight. I can feel all the way down to the pan. So. Okay, now I'm supposed to slice around with a sharp knife to give it a nice pattern. Okay, I'm going to try with this knife and see if it cuts. Pretty good. I'm going to go with it. So I'm supposed to cut the lower one too, so I'll go back in the same spot and cut that lower ball. Okay, so now I'm going to cover that with the plastic wrap again and put it back on my proving mat and let that prove for another hour. The instructions actually say to place this in a large plastic bag, but this will do the trick. Okay, it's been a little bit over an hour because I decided to make some cookies, some chocolate chip cookies, but the cottage loaf is proved. It has the right texture. You should be able to push a finger into it and it doesn't completely come back, but it does spring back a little bit. And mine is a little bit slanted, but nothing I can do about it at this point. One of the instructions says to heat up a pan, and I forgot to do that, but I filled it up with water. It's supposed to make steam in the oven and to give this some moisture. So I'll do that first, put that in the oven on the rack beneath where I'm going to put the bread. The oven is heated to 450 degrees, and after 15 minutes, I'm supposed to reduce the temperature to 375 and then bake it for another 20 to 25 minutes. So okay, after 15 minutes, I'll reduce that oven temperature to 375. Well, after 15 minutes, I turned the temperature down to 375, and then I set the timer again for 20 minutes, and it's done. So I checked the temperature. It's about 200 degrees on the inside, and I call this a success. It's leaning a little bit, but I think it's good. I'll be excited to try it once it cools. So that's the end of this episode. And the next episode is the Showstopper Challenge. So, of course, it has to be something elaborate. And we have to make something out of bread. I can't remember the exact criteria, but I'll tell you next time. But I do remember that you have to make 2 or 3 different types of bread, and they have to have different flavorings, and you can only use natural flavorings and natural colorings. So if you want to color something green, you might use spinach or basil. Some of the contestants used squid ink, very British, to make the bread black. But yeah, so that will be my challenge for next time. Please share this video and like it, and tell your friends to subscribe if they might enjoy it. And I'll see you next time. Thank you. All right, let's check it out. It's done. It's delicious.